well, the conversation's about art and God, and it's mostly about art, and at the end, I run out of time, and I have to sort of say, this is how we would do God. But it applies to what I'm going to talk about today is really the lost way of traditional American philosophy, which has a way of looking at lots of spheres of human activity and human endeavor beyond the sort of narrow ways that we look at things today. And just like we've sort of lost touch with William James and Josiah Royce and Charles Sanders Peirce and the pragmatist tradition and the St. Louis Hegelians and all the folks that were doing great work at Harvard in the early 20th century, I mean, you just have to look at our politics today, which doesn't seem to be based on anything except what different people want or how people want things to be. And recognize that, when Thomas Jefferson wrote, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal," that's founded on a metaphysics. It goes back to, and it's one you can agree with or disagree with, and we can have a discussion about that. But when you unhook all of your ways of thinking about the experiences of life, and the two in particular we're going to talk about, art and religion, it gets very difficult. It gets very difficult to have conversations, and I think that's kind of where we are today. And maybe we can have some conversation about that. So this presentation is also a little bit autobiographical, in that we're going to be focusing on the work of my teacher, Paul Weiss, who is considered one of the greatest of American philosophers, probably the leading metaphysician in the American tradition, one of 30 or so people featured in in Open Court's Library of Living Philosophers, along with Albert Einstein and Rudolf Carnap and his teacher, Alfred North Whitehead. Again, hardly read or written about or taught today. It's just sort of fallen out of fashion, I think, more out of laziness than the value of the material itself, and I hope to be able to share a little bit of that with you. I was very, very lucky. I had completed my undergraduate work at Catholic University. Like Weiss, like Whitehead, I'll put myself in great company like Charles Sanders Peirce. I was a logician and studying computer science and engineering. And I was bored, and today I'd be working, for that young guy running what's that thing? The social media thing, the Facebook, whatever that's about. Yeah, you can see it's been a while since I've done that. And probably worth a lot of money. But I was bored out of my mind. And at Catholic University, you have to take the required philosophy courses. And of course, it's, Roman Catholic Christian philosophy. And it was interesting enough to say, I'd rather study, it's mostly the history of philosophy. So I say, I'd rather do this than, I was really good at the logic and math. And so I did an undergraduate degree in philosophy, and then I enrolled at the University of Maryland in the theoretical math program. And I was there partway through one semester, and again, just wasn't liking it. So I happened back to school, and I encountered the faculty secretary. Those of you that went to university back in the day, there was always a wonderful faculty secretary in every department. And this was the person who held the whole thing together and kept the harebrained professors on track and so forth. And this wonderful woman could see that I was just not happy, and she said, "Did you ever take a course with Paul Weiss?" And I said, "No, in 4 years here, just never happened." And it's because it's the Catholic University of America and Paul Weiss is an agnostic Jew, so we want to be a little careful with that. So they tried to keep him a little bit hidden away. Well, I took my first class in 1984, and I spent the next 7 years working very, very closely with him, almost on a daily basis. He was just a magnetic person. In his nearly 60-year teaching career, had many great students, including the philosopher Richard Rorty, some notable people of media, Dick Cavett, who I'm going to talk about in a second. William F. Buckley was his student at Yale and talks about Weiss in the book God and Man at Yale. Buckley was such an outcast at Yale because of his conservatism, and of course Weiss wasn't interested in that at all. But he saw this poor guy just had no friends at Yale. And he took him under his wing and helped him. And Buckley gives him some credit for that. Some other college presidents were his students. John Sober at BU was a student of Paul Weiss, and more recently, Father Robert Spitzer, who just retired as president at Gonzaga in Seattle. A tremendous physicist. Those of you that, if you watch Eternal World Network, you can see Father Spitzer's universe still on there today. And so, just an incredibly powerful and attractive person who himself experienced the American tradition of philosophy. He knew he was first-person experience. He was Alfred North Whitehead's premier student, knew John Dewey, edited the Peirce Papers when nobody knew who Charles Sanders Peirce was. This was, of course, after the time Charles Sanders Peirce died. And I had that very close relationship with him for 7 years, wrote my dissertation under him, and then for about the next 10 years while I was working and teaching, stayed in very, very close touch with him. I found in this book, I mentioned this at dinner last night, so this is where Shannon's little cutting remark about I'm a better administrator than, that's the best part of my humanity or something you said. In a letter from him in 1994, he said to me, and the letter's typed on this old typewriter that was probably from the 20s, he said, "If you're not careful, they're going to make you president of one of these places, and then you will never accomplish anything." So, like I said, regretfully, Paul Weiss and most other great American philosophers who I'm going to talk about today are hardly studied or talked about at all today. Paul Weiss is getting a little bit of what I think is unfortunate attention, and I just want to say a little bit of that. If you've seen the documentary, relatively new documentary by Raoul Peck entitled "I Am Not Your Negro," which is about the life and work of the noted black author James Baldwin and his struggle to have African American voices heard in this country, there's a clip in the documentary with a very, personally to me, embarrassing exchange between Paul Weiss and James Baldwin from the Dick Cavett show. So Dick Cavett had his show, and William F. Buckley, had his show Firing Line. If you go back, Firing Line's on Amazon Prime. You can go dig those up, and I guess when they didn't have anything else to do, they would bring poor Paul Weiss on the shows. And in this particular clip, Paul Weiss is interested in talking about philosophy and fundamental things, and he's not interested he thinks black experience is a distraction. And he deals with James Baldwin very dismissively and condescendingly. And it's the kind of thing that, it's 50 years later, but in today's context of Black Lives Matter, it just makes you go, wow, we haven't moved a whole heck of a long way. And again, a lot of the conversation about Paul Weiss today is about that clip from that documentary. And I just want to tell you, he was the first person to integrate, to have students that came from Howard University in Washington, D.C. In the 1940s to come to Yale when Yale wasn't yet. So there are a lot of other things there. And again, we look at things through little snippets nowadays, and it certainly happened. And like I said, if you may cringe like I cringed when you see how he handles, and James Baldwin just wants to have somebody recognize how difficult it is to be black in this country and get somewhere. And Weiss, come on, you people need to focus on things. But again, it's 1968, which again, that's the year Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. Everyone who's taken a class from me knows that it all starts, we have to go through the whole history of philosophy before we can do anything. So for the next 20 minutes, you're going to have a whirlwind tour. We're not going to take you through a lot of metaphysics is just an incredibly tough subject, and there's a whole reading list for you on the book. Senator Kinski, you can write these down. You asked for a reading list. This is a very famous painting, The Death of Socrates, by Jacques-Louis David. And it's a great starting point for us. You can see all of Socrates' disciples, those of you that have read the Phaedo, which is the story of the death of Socrates. There they all are. Plato is this old man at the end of the bed, which is not accurate because he was very young. He was one of the youngest ones at the time. And I think that's Echecrates who's handing him the hemlock. And the story's important, or the painting's important for us for two reasons. There are two fundamental tensions or movements in Western philosophy, at least. One is criticism, and the other is speculation and attempting to construct answers that explain human experience. And those of you that know about the trial of Socrates know that he was tried and convicted. There were three convictions: one for corrupting the youth, the second was not worshiping the gods of the city, and the third was appearing to make the weaker argument defeat the stronger, being a rhetorician. Two of those are about criticism, and criticism drives people crazy. It makes people uncomfortable. I tell the old joke, the old philosophy professor joke of, you shouldn't teach Nietzsche to freshmen in the first semester. And the reason is they go home at Thanksgiving and in the middle of grace say God is dead. And then mom and dad call the dean and you've got problems. So you always save Nietzsche until the second semester. But corrupting the youth is a charge that philosophy departments deal with all the time, because a lot of people are running around with unreflected upon opinions about things and attitudes they've never asked themselves any questions about. And so what are the philosophy professors teaching? How do you know that? How do you know that's true? What is truth, by the way? And that gets you into some trouble. And if you have only criticism, and so Socrates is drinking the hemlock, and the worst charges, his critical activity is what drove the Athenians crazy. But at the same time, he's saying, don't give up on the search for what is true. And it's difficult, but we need to keep asking questions, and we need to keep trying to find foundations for how we think about all these different things we do as human beings, including our political life. What is justice? We're having a big debate in this country right now about whether Robert E. Lee gets a pass or not. That's a question of justice. And it isn't just about what historians think or about what people's attitudes are. Robert E. Lee isn't right or wrong based on a majority opinion about Robert E. Lee. Does that make sense? He's either right or wrong based on something we call justice. And if you're going to say, well, justice is different at different times, well, you might have to give a pass to the Nazis. I mean, and if you say there's no justice, or justice is contemporalized or textualized, Paul Weiss doesn't say that, and I'm going to show you the system which purports to be able to explain how we can have something like a universal justice. Hard to get at, we argue about it all the time, but in the 1850s, the law said if a slave runs away, you have to give the slave back. Just dumb, right? And very moral people said, no, I'm not giving the slave back. That's a stupid law. So just because that's what the law says, that's not necessarily what's just. And this is about that with respect to art. And so, again, now we'll jump ahead a whole bunch of years to the other top philosopher in the history of Western philosophy, Immanuel Kant, and this is the Kritik der Urteilskraft, which is judgment, the critique of judgment, which is about beauty and art. And the only reason I throw Kant in here is that all of our questions today, actually all of our questions about everything in philosophy, if philosophy people from UW see this, they're going to say, this guy doesn't know what he's talking about, and he's hopelessly out of date. So can you not let them see the podcast? I claim that after Plato, Kant is the second greatest philosopher in the Western tradition. And everything we talk about today in philosophy has been affected by his critical approach to explaining the different problems and laying out the different categories for our discussion. And the focus of our question today is, what qualifies as, here's some examples. What qualifies as art? What is good or great art? Do you have to be an artist to create art? I don't know if you can see this that well. This is just a what would one call it? An installation. And Dwayne Hanson's Flea Market Lady. And the first time I saw it, I was like, oh, and I didn't realize it was an installation. And depending on the kind of art you're talking about, there are different kinds of problems in performing arts. For example, if I go to the piano and plink out a beautiful Beethoven piece, one key at a time, is it beautiful art? And how do we talk about the separateness of the piece from the performance? One day I'm going to take the drawing class, which my faculty offer here at the college, and I've threatened to do that. And I know at some point already that I'm going to draw an apple, and I'm going to take the drawing and put it in a frame and hang it on my wall at home and say, this is my art. And we do like to say, yes, this is art. If you think it's art, you know, we tell the young people that if you think it's art, it's art. And we do say art is, beauty is in the eye of the beholder and things like that. But in fact, we don't work that way, do we? We think this is something that can be taught. We think there's good art and bad art. I mean, this is what artists do. And there's all kinds of conversation around art criticism. So, can we give a philosophical account of art which allows us to do justice to artists, the artistic work, and doesn't reduce it to some other set of categories? There is a Marxist philosophy of art, for example. The Marxist philosophy of art in general says that the purpose of art is to improve people's social well-being. Well, I know a lot of artists that don't think that you can capture all of what's going on with that kind of an explanation. There are scientific explanations of art. It's about biology, or it's about psychology. That's not enough. I don't want to say it's maybe not enough. That's not enough. That's not enough either. So more history for you in one slide. We'll get right to modern American philosophy pretty quick. But I just want to point out that until the modern period, which there are a lot of things happening around 1500. The Reformation, there are political revolutions, the scientific revolution. All these things sort of change at once. And Francis Bacon's famous dictum that we have to stop thinking about universals and sort of just grab on to the scientific method and accept that that's truth. And today, dominant philosophy, analytic philosophy and logical positivist philosophy, which are still the dominant movements in this country and in Britain, would say that philosophy is done answering questions, and it stopped answering questions about this time and turned it over to science. And that if you want an answer about what's real, you talk to a physicist or a chemist. And there are no other questions about what's real beyond that. And that's why I think people aren't interested in contemporary metaphysics. But I am excited to hear that the university is hiring a metaphysician. And my eyes lit up for a minute and wondered, what condition is my vita in? And then Paul meanly said, have you published anything lately? Anyway, so I'm here for a little while longer. So again, I'm going to get you to Paul Weiss, I promise. But there are a number of things happening in American philosophy which are distinctive and unique in the 19th century, and which lay the groundwork for the positions his teacher, Alfred North Whitehead, that he takes, and that I still hold today. There's a terrific book by a scholar, Philip Gura, it's entitled American Transcendentalism. It's fairly recent. And he explains transcendentalism as a way of perceiving the world centered on individual consciousness rather than external fact. So what I'm trying to pull out of the transcendentalists, and actually all of these people, is a kind of revolt against scientific materialism. which is that view that says a scientific formula is going to capture everything that matters. Paul Weiss, early in his career, believed it could. Alfred North Whitehead, who we're going to talk about in a minute, once believed it could. Charles Sanders Peirce, another logician. It's interesting, these people do it for a while, and then they confront areas of human activity that they're like, that can't be it. Religion, for example. But as I said earlier, so New England Transcendentalism, we know about that movement. The St. Louis Hegelians, these are very interesting people trying to live in a kind of communitarian kind of way. Their biggest influence was they founded the Journal of Speculative Philosophy. And it allowed the pragmatists to have a vehicle for publishing this sort of non-standard work. And those of you in academics know that, my God, if you had something that didn't fit into the narrow confines of our scholarly journals and things, you'd just be kind of out of luck with your publishing career. But the Journal of Speculative Philosophy becomes a vehicle for people to do different things, and you find William James and others starting to work there. There was huge influence of both pragmatism and Hegel at Harvard. William James and Josiah Royce are teaching there. William James is the pragmatist, is the inheritor of Peirce's legacy. Josiah Royce is probably the leading Hegelian on the American continent, believes in absolute idealism. They're famous for their sort of friendly debates and arguments that lasted all their careers. And there's a fascinating literature because James is believes in a kind of radical individualism, what we would call today. And Josiah Royce is warning him, you got to be careful with that, because it can be destructive of people's way of thinking about society. And as I was reading that recently, I was thinking, oh my goodness, we really ought to go back and read this debate between William James and Josiah Royce to sort of give us some context of where we are today. John Dewey did not teach at Harvard, but had a huge influence there. And Charles Sanders Peirce didn't teach at Harvard either. We'll talk a little bit about Peirce in particular. Considered the father of American pragmatism, brilliant and prolific. There is still 100,000 pages of Peirce's work which has not been published. It's all on microfilm at Harvard. The material was acquired by Harvard after his death. And the published works, most of the published works and some of his, they went through some of the stuff. Charles Hartshorne and Paul Weiss, this is what he did as a graduate student. They edited the 8-volume series of the Peirce Papers at Harvard in the 1930s. And people had sort of, just from his published material, realized that he was a genius and a uniquely American genius. Got into some scandal trouble at Johns Hopkins and was dismissed, let go, and spent the rest of his life trying to live off the land on a farm that he had used the last of his money to buy. And it was, friends and neighbors had to share food with he and his wife through the remainder of their life. So it's not only me who suffers from lack of reward for the next figure is Alfred North Whitehead, who came to, and I don't want you to read Principia Mathematica, by the way, but it's the work for which he and Bertrand Russell are probably best well known. The best book of Whitehead to look at is Adventures of Ideas. It's the most exciting book. But this is the book where he and Bertrand Russell think they can provide a foundation for everything that is in terms of mathematical logic. That is the goal of Principia Mathematica. And Whitehead is the greatest, I think, one of the greatest logicians, greatest mathematicians of that century. But there's some, and I'd love to know more about what happened, how he came to end up at Harvard, because his thought progresses beyond the logic to becoming the founder of so-called process philosophy. And process philosophy says discrete entities are not what are ultimately real. Processes are what are real. And Whitehead's key insight, which he shared with Paul Weiss, was that It is a fundamental mistake to accept a theory about experience as being more fundamental or more primary than the experience. And that's what we do when we say science, the sun is 90 million miles away. Well, not the sun that goes outside and makes me hot. That's some kind of a theoretical sun. But we've come to think that everything that science says, that's ultimate reality. That's how we make our decisions. And that's how we define or account for everything else in the realm of our experience, whether it be God, whether it be art, whether it be justice. How does science explain? Well, science will explain justice as some kind of innate thing that because you're human, it's whatever most humans have as a sort of physiological quality. That's what makes justice. Socrates could tear that argument apart fairly quickly. Whitehead came to Harvard. Weiss, by the way, grew up on the Lower East Side in the Garment District, worked his way through City College, got his baccalaureate there, did his master's degree and his doctorate at Harvard in 2 years. And Whitehead saved him from his attachment to symbolic logic. And they became very, very close friends. They worked very closely, much as I did with Weiss. For many years, Whitehead got him his traveling fellowship to Germany in the late 1920s, which was very interesting. There were a number of American Jewish philosophy professors traveling in Germany at that time. Leo Strauss was there, and a number of others. And Paul Weiss took courses from Heidegger at Freiburg. And Heidegger, I don't know if you know this, the Nazis made him a rector, which is the university president, after the takeover. And there have always been these questions about Martin Heidegger. Was he a Nazi, and is that in the philosophy somehow? Well, Weiss claimed that Heidegger could tell he was Jewish and mistreated him. And so there was, and I was, the first class I took I said, what about Heidegger? And there was silence in the classroom, because you just don't talk about Heidegger and the Nazi. You would not raise, no Nazi for Paul Weiss could possibly have thought anything of value. I mean, it was just not part of his, and I guess that's certainly understandable, but this is 1984, 1985, and everybody who is doing metaphysics in North America that isn't doing this, they're doing Heidegger and hermeneutics and different kinds of phenomenology. That's probably what you're going to get, Paul, I would guess, is some kind of a Heidegger person. That's not metaphysics, by the way. But here's a nice little quote. This is a photo that Rex Arney let me use for this presentation. This is a little quote from Whitehead. And if you walk away with anything for today, it's just this point that there's more to knowledge than science. A couple of others where there's some influence on Paul Weiss's work. I don't know if any of you are familiar with the work of Suzanne Langer. She was also a student of Whitehead's. He taught at Radcliffe, as well as, the women are at Radcliffe and the boys are over at Hart. And so Whitehead was working at both places, and Langer was his student there. And she is another anti-empiricist, someone who has a kind of anti-empiricist, anti-materialist stamp on her philosophy. She actually dedicated this book, this groundbreaking book, Philosophy in a New Key, to her teacher, Alfred North Whitehead. If you read this and some of her essays on art, you'll see a great deal of sympathy between what she's doing and what my teacher, Paul Weiss, is saying. A couple of quotes from Suzanne Langer. Nothing is so elusive as an unsymbolized conception. It pulsates and vanishes like the very faint stars, and inspires rather than fixes expression. And art is the articulation, not the stimulation or catharsis of feeling, the articulation of feeling, and the height of technique is simply the highest power of this sensuous revelation and wordless abstraction. Weiss was going to try to say more about it than this, but she's got a particularly powerful way of understanding what artists are doing. And one day I was walking around, this is a mural that we have up on the second floor of our Whitney Center for the Arts, and you can go upstairs and see it in the other building. This is a quote from Nelge, who the mural is a picture of Nelge, and I just thought, wow, that sounds an awful lot like what Suzanne Langer is. So whenever I see a philosopher confirming what an artist actually says, I think they must be on the right track. And then finally, before I talk about, get into Weiss, in the mid-1980s when I was working with him, Paul Weiss was still quite a bit of a celebrity in New York, and I had the opportunity to travel with him to New York City in 1987. You were making fun of Limestone, Maine. Most people think people from the East, like me, we all live in one big city that sort of stretches the thing. Well, but where I come from, Sheridan, Wyoming is 100 times more cosmopolitan than where I'm from or where I grew up and where I spent a lot of my life. And it just never occurred, I'd never been to New York City. So I'm going to New York City, a number of us students, with Paul Weiss, and he's quite popular with Woody Allen, Susan Sontag. I was able to, obviously not interested in, the two of them had a wonderful conversation about the work she's doing on art and that he was doing. And so again here, I think if you read, and there's an essay at the beginning of this book, Styles of Radical Will, which talks about the creative process. And this is one of Paul Weiss's last books called Creative Ventures. And I can see echoes of that conversation and that interchange between he and Susan Sontag. Okay, so let's just line them up. Philosophical first principles is what Paul Weiss is interested in. Is there a way to articulate and find something in common with all these different domains? Politics, religion, art, society, which doesn't reduce one to the science and math. We're not, because we said they're not everything, doesn't mean they're not something, okay? It has its own domain, it has its, and certainly it's very successful. We live in a technological world because of that. But we're simply claiming that's not the only thing. And that as a matter of fact, a religious viewpoint is no better or worse than a scientific, is no less true than a scientific viewpoint. That an artistic viewpoint is no less true than a scientific viewpoint, which would be scandalous if I said that in a philosophy job interview. At some places still today, a lot of places actually. This is just a history of these great speculative philosophers and the principles which they used to sort of explain the structure which makes all this variation possible. And again, you could just leave it as an infinite plurality of different things and never have an explanation about it, right? You could just say art's art, and science is science, and politics is politics, and justice is justice, and they don't have anything to do with each other. I mean, and if there is anything going on today, sort of generally, I sort of think sometimes that's where we are. This view is trying to say, can I find some way to connect all this that explains what it means to be a being in this universe that doesn't resolve one into the other, the way Marx does, for example. Weiss has three components in his metaphysical landscape or universe. Actualities, if you go back here and just see Whitehead, it talks about what are called actual occasions and entities, but they are moments snipped out of process, which is this ongoing stream, sort of what Heraclitus would talk about, just an endless becoming, and then we sort of abstract out an actual entity, and that's what you or I are. We're just thinking about something which is a flow abstractly, and that's who I am. Well, Weiss, while he loved his old teacher, said that's nonsense. I'm radically separate from any kind of flow. I'm different from you. I'm an actuality. I can stand up over against other things. Now, at the same time, he's not going to deny that because the problem of, like, William James is to have individuals that are so individual, they can't be together with any other individual in the same universe. That is the problem of individuality. If everybody's an individual, you'd not be able to talk to each other. You wouldn't even be in the same space and time in terms of the metaphysics. So there's no such thing as a pure individual. The second and all actualities are products of two other components. Finalities, also called conditions, and these have changed over time. In Weiss's first book, Reality, he only has 4, and he doesn't have this other third component, the Dunamis. So I mean, the book Reality is written in 1938, and this book is written in 1995. So I suppose you're allowed to develop your view over a period of time. I'm sorry? Yeah. So these finalities are structures that undergird. It's how we explain rationality. It's how we explain beauty. It's how we explain truth. It's how we explain the substantiality of actualities, their ability to not just be an appearance that disappears, but to stand up. So they're he's rolling over in his grave. I would say they're like Aristotle's forms, except they're not. They don't have the limitations the Aristotelian universals do. And then the third one, which comes late in Weiss's thinking, is called the Dunamis. And the Dunamis is what is responsible, the conjunction of I'm going to borrow a page from Susan. I got a couple minutes, right? 5 minutes. I didn't know we could write on the board. When I interviewed here, I was a big shot from Boston, MIT and all that, and I went into one of the classrooms, and they didn't have boards like this. They had what are called smart boards, and you can only write on them with certain things. And they asked me a question, and I grabbed one of the permanent markers, and I wrote on the $40,000 thing or whatever it is, and everyone in the room was like, wow. Wow. So we have, I'm going to put Dunamis down here as a ground. And sort of the ocean is the way to think of it. I think I talk about Jung's collective unconscious. I mean, there are nothing that Weiss does is uniquely his. Another rollover in the grave of my great teacher. And he would say what Jung is talking about in the collective unconscious. That's deja vu. That's I feel like I've known you. That's a subterranean way in which everything is interconnected already somehow. That's what the Dunamis provides. And then finalities, or conditions, of which there are 5, substance, being, ideality, and so forth. What are they? Substance, being, possibility, existence, and unity. Okay, go to the chase. Unity is God. So God is not the ultimate in Paul Weiss. He's unultimate. And he's probably not a he. It's not, and he would say, look, I'm not denying anything a religious person. I'm just trying to tell you what philosophy can say about what religious people are calling God. Well, the great advance is they don't deny it. And we'll talk about the method that gets to this in a minute. And then we have actualities. And every actuality comes about as a result of a little spin-off of a part of the Dunamis, and then the interaction of all 5 of the conditions in a different kind of mix. And whether it's a human person or a rock or a work of art which is created by an artist, this is how you explain those actualities. And it's these different components in different play which, now whether you agree with the view or not, this is how he's going to try to explain a variety of unique human experiences without, and it's by the different mixtures. God is more involved in some than in others. Being is more involved in some than in others. This one, existence, which deals with space-time and what he calls volumosity, is where art. It's where art comes. And I've got a couple of to talk on art, and I haven't talked very much about art yet. So there's just a little thing for you to make you think about what is art. I think we would say that's art. And no? Did you shake your head no?
No, I didn't. No, she definitely didn't.
There's the book. So a couple of quotes from the book. Endlessly nuanced, rich beyond anyone's capacity to exhaust, a creation, he's talking about an artistic creation, for example, is an outcome of an individual's the artist's specialized use of conditions in the Dunamis as joined again and again under the guidance and control of an ideal that a creator has committed himself to realize. Remember I said you can't forget about the artist and what an artist is trying to do. Artists are struggling to achieve something. And so you can't have an explanation of art that just says, oh, they just gave themselves over to something and they're merely a channel for something. Artists are struggling and working to try to do something. But it's not totally them. They have material which resists. So that's the ideal that committed itself. The result is sustained and grained through the use of recalcitrant material. The material fights you, right? I mean, Jane, you're a poet. Sometimes the words don't come, right? A created work utilizes and overrides what is used to produce it. Conditions in the Dunamis are joint in its units, it should be joined in its units. A privacy enables its excellence to be focused on and realized. The material used gives it grain and stability. And so that's art, that's how art comes about. And so God so can we have God as a creator, and what Weiss would call it is the unifier. In a way, he would say, yes, that together any actuality has more or less unity to it. What do we mean by unit? A human being is kind of a pinnacle of a unified being. You're not just a material body. As a matter of fact, the material body takes where you move it to, unless you fall over or something, and then gravity, but then you pick yourself back up. So you have a kind of unity and control, right, that other kinds of beings may not have. And as a matter of fact, we talk about art that way too, don't we also? We would say, it's missing, there's something not quite, this is what the teacher might tell the student. It just doesn't go together, or the writing doesn't go together. Some of the plays I saw last week in the theater festival, I think just need a little, wonderful, wonderful stuff, but it's not quite there yet, right? They've got to do a little more work to create a unity out of it. So we're back to this. This is where I'll end, and then take your questions. And those of you that have taken a course from me know I love this passage from the Phaedo, where near the very end of the argument, everybody's discouraged because they don't have an answer. So the question is, Socrates, you're about to drink the hemlock. Is this it? Our beloved teacher's about to die. We don't want you to go away. They're crying. And he's saying, haven't you people learned anything from this? It isn't about me. Make sure you don't let the argument die. And when philosophers use the word argument, we don't mean a fight. We mean the conversation of trying to find a solution. Because that would be far worse. We should all, he says to, I think it's Kebbies, that he says, I suppose you're going to cut your hair, your beautiful curls. And he says, oh, yes. He said, well, you shouldn't. Or if you give up, then we all should cut our hair in mourning, if we let the argument die. And that's what I think has happened in our society. And I don't know, the other kind of argument, we're doing plenty of that. We were talking, we don't go on Facebook because I get yelled at too much for things and I don't want to know. But the sort of dispassionate, which is the word Kant would use, search for an answer together, that's what he means by argument. And he predicts, if you let that go, you're done. And if that American tradition of philosophy, if we could only recover that, because that's what those folks were saying. One of the key components of pragmatism is it's okay to not have a perfect answer as long as it's better than the answer we had. You just got to keep moving. But if you accept the scientific, the answer is either right or wrong, it's binary, you get into a kind of false logic. So I'm sorry for the false advertising that it was art and God. You got some art and not very much God and a lot of history of philosophy. But I'm glad that's over. Thank you very much.
We have just under 10 minutes to ask Paul questions.
Yes, sir.
With regard to Whitehead, is there a distinction between process theology and process philosophy?
Paul, you might know this better than me coming out of the religious studies. I think I would say it's an extension of that of some of those insights. So there's certainly a relationship, and that there's, but I don't want to get on to, I'm on weak ground there. I don't know, but I would guess that from what I know of it, it's about, getting away from the notion of discrete entities and get to, Christ's ongoing salvation, for example, as a process. That would be process theology. That's where I would see process theology catching on to the insights of process. Does that sound okay, Paul? Keith? I'm afraid because you're an art critic.
Yeah, just two quick things. You mentioned Rorty, and he's having an amazing sort of resurgence of interest. The book he wrote back in 1997 has been reprinted, and on this last flight I just read this current collection of essays, and his bottom line thesis is to keep the conversation going.
Mm-hmm.
So that kind of American pragmatism is more alive and well now than it was 20 years ago. I would think. And secondly, with the problem with...
Still don't have enough of it, though, do we?
Right. The problem with trying to define art is that it's the most slippery and fuzzy of terms.
Mm-hmm.
It's a set of social and cultural activities and not a thing. And the word is often used in an honorific sense. Well, that's art. Right. That's not. Right. Instead of a descriptive sense. But even trying to use it in a descriptive sense needs to come to grips with this notion that it's a collection of social norms and processes.
It's only that? I can't agree.
Yeah, I would say it's primarily that.
No, I don't. I think then there's well, we'll have lunch and there has to be an ontological foundation to it, I would say. There has. I wouldn't deny that there are those things as well, but to say it's only conventional, then I think you'd have to say you'd have to be willing to say justice is conventional, and truth is conventional, and the other things which in the history of I mean, it is no question it's a problem, and it is one of the most slippery ones. This is just my view. I'm not. You're wrong, but I'm not telling you you're wrong. Oh, and on that note, excellent points, Keith. Thank you.